Now that we understand a little bit about the architecture of group policy, let's take a look at some of the settings that we can set with group policy, some of the areas that we can create these policy settings. So there are 3 folders in the policies folders. You have software settings, Windows settings, and administrative templates. And I'm going to talk mostly about software and Windows settings. So policy settings can be managed or unmanaged. I talked about this previously. A managed policies reset the not configured when the object falls outside of the policy scope, and unmanaged policies are persistent. So policies in the computer configuration node. The computer configuration node applies policies to computers regardless of who logs onto the computer. So it happens before you even log in. So it's when the computer starts up. It applies computer configuration policies. Computer configuration policies are replicated about every 90 minutes. There is a way to manually push policies, but generally a lot of these policies sometimes require a restart of the computer, so they don't necessarily apply immediately. Sometimes you have to have a restart before they actually apply these policies. So some of the one of the computer configurations is software settings. Basically, software, if it's installed with MSI or the Windows Installer Service, you'll have a lot of flexibility in how you manage those applications. And under Windows settings, we have security policies for clients. We have startup and shutdown scripts, security settings, and some quality of service settings, which can define how internet traffic, or network traffic is shaped on the local area network. And under security settings, there's 100 policies under security settings, and some of these, the most important ones, are under account policies and local policies. So this is where you're going to find a lot of these policies that you can use to enforce your IT security policy. So local policies, there's audit configurations, so you can configure how auditing occurs. In other words, sometimes you have to audit when somebody attempts to do something on a machine that they're not authorized to do. You may want to capture that information or capture what people are doing on systems. You can save those events and configure how that's saved so you can use that information later on. So auditing object access, there are a couple steps for turning on auditing for object access. You can enable the audit object access policy for success, failure, or both. And you can enable auditing on targeted objects for success, failure, or both. And this is what the dialog box looks like for turning on auditing. If you want to change the default auditing, there is a command line tool that you can run to do that, auditpol/clear. So local policies, user rights management. User rights define the actions users can take on a computer, so more than 40 user right policies can be assigned, and the default domain controller's policies specify user rights. So security options. The security options subnode has 100 settings. One category of security policy configured right away is the user account control. That determines what happens when a user tries to do something that requires elevation. You've probably seen this before. It's when a user tries to do something in their computer and you get the UAC dialog pops up and says, you don't have permission to do this. Are you sure you want to allow this to happen? And you can define how that works. In other words, you can make it so that standard users won't be able to bypass that window. They would have to get an administrator to log in to make changes to that computer when the UAC dialog comes up. All right, so here's some other options under security options that you'll see. And many of these are discussed in your textbook, so I don't want to go through each of these one at a time, but there are certainly lots of options on the security policy. Restricted group policy allows the administrator to control the membership of both domain groups and local groups on member computers. So the node is empty by default, and you can configure it by adding groups that you want to restrict. Okay. There's also file system. The file system node enables the configuration permissions and auditing files and folders. So you can enable auditing on access to folders, for example, and also set policy on certain file system objects. And then we get the software restriction policies. So as far as software restriction policies go, there's really 4 basic ways that you can restrict software. One of them is the path to the software. So in other words, when somebody tries to run some application or some executable, you can have policy that restricts whether or not they can run that program. And one way to do that is the path, right? So you can say if it's a certain file name, in other words, then somebody can't run files with a certain name, but that's not a great way to do it because somebody could just rename the file and it'll still work, right? So one other way you could do it is using a hash. So if you have the hash of an executable file, you can say any file that has the same hash cannot be run, or can only be run by certain people. And you can't change the hash by simply renaming the executable. You'd have to compile a new version of that executable in order to get a new hash, and most people wouldn't be able to do that, although there's some ways to hack around that. So the next way you could handle this is through certificates. So applications can be signed by the developer. So Microsoft has a whole application signing certificate program in place that we're going to talk about later on in the course when we talk about certificates. So you could restrict applications from running unless they have a signed certificate. In other words, they're a trusted application. So that would prevent people from running rogue programs that they just randomly download from the internet. But they can still run programs that have a valid certificate. But you could also restrict which certificates are valid. And then the other example is Network Zone, where you can limit running applications that are downloaded from the internet. In other words, so if an application was obtained from the public internet, then they can't run that application. But if they downloaded the file from, say, the local area network, then they would be able to run that program. So you could also do it that way. And you can certainly do a combination of these different mechanisms. You could say, even if it has a signed valid certificate, if it's downloaded from the internet, you can't run it. It has to be, obtained somewhere inside the local area network. So those policies can be figured with enforcement, designated file types, trusted publishers, which I sort of just talked about. Then there's this app blocker. This was added in for Windows 7 with 2008. App blocker gives you some additional control over how applications are run, or whether or not they can be run. It gives you some additional filterings above and beyond what we discussed previously. There are 4 categories: executable rules, Windows install rules, script rules, and packaged application rules. So this is the properties dialog box for App Blocker. And again, you have some additional capability with App Blocker. You can do more granular rules, and I believe you can use WMI to write those rules manually. But you can set conditions for these rules, like the publisher, the path, the file hash. So again, it's somewhat similar to the one we talked about before, but this gives you just a bit more granular control over which applications can be run by certain users in group policy. And this is what the dialog box looks like for the wizard that you can use to create those rules. So you can use automatically generated rules by using that are created by Windows after analyzing the files in a folder that you select. So in other words, if you have an application that you want to allow users to use, you can have it analyze those files, and it will create a rule for you, which you can then publish. So you could use that as well. The other thing I probably should mention is all of these things that you're doing in Active Directory, all these group policies that you're setting. And again, I'm not showing you all of these individual group policies. This is something you're going to do in the lab. So when you do your lab, you're going to see some of the specific policies that you can set. You're going to see some of the granular control that you have over group policy. But those file settings are set in, they are going to be set in a text file, essentially. Now, prior to Windows 2008, that file was a .adm file, which was sort of a proprietary markup for Microsoft. They switched to an XML-based file, which is an ADMX file. So you can theoretically work with these ADMX files that store the group policy settings directly if you wanted to, without using the UI. So if you wanted to go in with a text editor and look at them and possibly make changes, although it can be a little risky sometimes if you're not sure what you're doing in there. But I certainly would encourage you to take a look at those. It gives you some idea of how they work. And again, they're really just XML files. And then you have administrative templates. So the administrative templates folder has a couple of subnodes, which you can see here in my PowerPoint. But the policy in the user configuration mode. So policies set under the user configuration mode follow a user wherever he or she logs on. The user configuration node lacks most of the security settings and account policies than computer configuration node. So you have sort of a subset of security settings for the user node that you have more options under the computer configuration mode. And then you have software settings. under computer configuration. And finally, Windows settings, which has 4 subnodes. You have scripts for log on and log off, security settings for Windows, folder restriction, or I'm sorry, folder redirection, which allows you to redirect folders for a user's profile. In other words, when users log on, you can redirect their home directory, for example, to a file server somewhere. That way, none of their files are being stored on their own computer. They're being stored in a central location. And then policy-based quality of service, which again is for network bandwidth, defining how the network is utilized by a Windows client. All right. So managing GPO status and link status. After a GPO is created, it can be done. It can be in any of the following states that you see here. So you can see here, for example, you can have an unlinked GPO. It could be enabled. It could be disabled. That would be the link. And then the GPO itself could be enabled, the user configuration settings disabled, computer configuration disabled, or all settings disabled. So those are the various states that you can have for both the GPO and the link. Remember, the link is nothing more than the connection of that group policy to an Active Directory object. Group policies won't really do anything unless they're linked to a group policy, or I'm sorry, to an Active Directory object. If you create a group policy that says don't allow auto run for CD-ROM, for example, but you don't link that to any object, it's not going to apply to anyone. So they do have to be linked in order to be useful. All right, and then we have the ADMX Central Store. I talked a little about the ADMX earlier, but it's just a centralized location for maintaining these ADMX files, which should be by default in the system root sysvol domain name folder. So you'll find those ADMX files that we talked about.